Welcome to your video on quadratic formula. The last video that you watched focused on a formula called the discriminant, and we talked about how the discriminant is a part of a larger formula, and today we're going to be looking at that larger formula. So the quadratic formula is kind of this big, scary looking thing, but hopefully you recognize some of the letters here. You see the A's, B's, and C's, and yes, those are the same ABCs that we've been working with when we've been graphing quadratics. If you're wondering why we need this formula, its purpose is so that we can find the zeros, which are also called the x-intercepts of a parabola, when the equation can't be factored. So I thought to get us going here before we actually get to the formula, we would look at a couple of examples that we have previously studied. So in the past, when we solve a quadratic equation, your steps have been to factor and then to use the ZPP. So let's look at a couple of examples here. You'll notice that both of these are set up in standard form, and in number 1, we notice that in front of the x squared we have a 1. This sets us up for the x method. So we make our x, and we put the 2 on top and the 3 on the bottom, and then we look for factors of 2 that add to 3. And this one's pretty easy because there are only one set of factors for 2, which gives us our solution of x plus 1 times x plus 2 equals 0. When you apply the ZPP, you're going to set each of those factors equal to 0. And when you solve each of those equations, you will get your 2 solutions. What this tells us, again, is where this graph, if we were to plot it, crosses the x-axis. So we know that there are x-intercepts or solutions of -1 and -2. And this is roughly what our graph would look like. So we've done problems like this before. And when we look at number 2, it looks exactly like number 1. So we draw our x and we fill in our numbers, but we quickly realize that this would be prime. And so back in the day, we would actually write prime, or if we were solving, we would write no solution. This time, we're not going to have any more primes. So I don't know if that's good news or bad news for you, but what we're going to do when we can't factor it is we're going to use something called the quadratic formula, and that's the formula that I showed you before. So nothing's ever going to have a no solution anymore unless we have what's called a negative discriminant, and that's what we looked at before. So here is a look at the quadratic formula. This is the formula that we had on the very beginning of this video. And I just wanted to point out a couple of things about the formula. First, you're going to notice that we have a negative b, or what I like to say is the opposite of b. And that's really important. That's usually one spot where students make mistakes. So if b is a negative number, you're going to change it to positive, and vice versa. Second, you'll notice what's underneath that big square root is a little formula that should look familiar. That is the discriminant. And remember, this is the piece that tells us how many solutions we're going to have. So if we come up with a discriminant that is a negative number, we can't take the square root of a negative number. So that'll be the only time that we write no solution. When we are going to solve a problem using the quadratic formula, we're going to follow 3 steps. The first step is to identify A, B, and C. And remember that these just come from the standard form of an equation for a parabola. And we do have to have that standard form equal to 0. After you've identified your ABCs, you are going to find the discriminant. And that's the formula that we looked at in the last video, b squared minus 4ac. And once you've done that, you're just going to plug all of those pieces into the quadratic formula, which again is at the top of this page. So let's look at a couple of examples. If you look at the directions, they tell us to use quadratic formula, and then if necessary, round answers to the nearest hundredth. So this is where things are going to change a little bit. We aren't going to have always nice whole numbers. Sometimes you will, but more often than not, when you use quadratic formula, you're going to get some decimal answers. And the nearest hundredth, as noted in the parentheses, just means 2 decimal places. So if you notice, number 1 is set up in standard form, and when we identify the ABCs, we have A is 3, B is -4, and C is -2. We then take those values and plug them into the discriminant. You have to be really careful with your parentheses and your negatives. And then also, obviously, when you plug them into your calculator, watch for those things as well. When you type this all in, you should get positive 40. And I would encourage you to work this out on your calculator and make sure you get the same answers as we do here. We've identified our ABCs, we've found the discriminant, so now we're going to plug it into the quadratic formula. So first we have to do the opposite of B. And so for us that's going to be a positive 4. Then we've got a plus or minus symbol, and then we have the square root of 40. Underneath we have 2 times A, so 2 times 3. Now the plus or the minus is sometimes confusing to students. So what we do is we basically just split it into 2 different cases. So on the top, we're going to do 4 plus the square root of 40 divided by 6. And on the bottom, we're going to do 4 minus the square root of 40 divided by 6. Now, most people can get this part figured out just fine. But then to get the final answer, a lot of times mistakes are made because of how it's entered into the calculator. So what you have to make sure you do is you have to do the top first. So you're going to do the 4 plus the square root of 40. And then you have to hit enter. Then you can divide. You absolutely cannot put this in your calculator all at one time. So hit enter after you do the top and then divide by the 6. So when you do this, for the top part of the answer, you get 1.72. And then for the bottom, for the second answer, you get negative 0.39. And I'd encourage you to press pause, use your calculator, and make sure that you can come up with these 2 values. Let's do one more example. This one's interesting because it is missing a term, and you just have to figure out which term that is. When you fill out the ABCs, we have A is 5, B is 0, and C is negative 8. We start again by plugging those into the discriminant formula. So we have 0 squared minus 4 times 5 times negative 8. And when you work that out, you should get 160. We now take all the pieces and plug those into the quadratic formula. And again, we start with the opposite of B. But when we have 0, 0 is its own opposite, so we can just go ahead and write 0. Then we've got plus or minus the square root of 160 divided by 2 times 5, 2 times that A value. So now we're to the part where we're going to split the problem apart into the 2 cases. So on the top, we have 0 plus the square root of 160 divided by 10. And on the bottom, we have 0 minus the square root of 160 divided by 10. Again, enter after doing the numerator, then divide. And when you work these out, and again, I would encourage you to do that on your own calculator. For the top, you should get a positive 1.26. And for the bottom, you should get a negative 1.26. All right, you are now ready to begin your practice with the quadratic formula.
Because